understanding Statolatry, we talked about that, and its fugitives, is a lot easier within our sort of geographic, intellectual Western tradition, right? Because we can identify the moments of inflection in which ideas about freedom and liberation and emancipation started materializing in the form of actual social movements and actual pressures on the ruling class and the powers that be. And then we saw this, this state, this bureaucracy gradually modernize itself, modeled on the monarchy of the papacy, right? Vertical, intolerant, repressive, based on law, with all kinds of ideologies of objectivity and reason behind it. All of this is very familiar to us. We seemed to step back yesterday when we talked about, well, not because after all, the early modern period, the first few hundred years of proto-capitalism, we also understand, right? The formation of Latin America, relations with indigenous peoples, issues of race. I mean, these are all somewhat familiar. We can identify, we can sort of discuss, have a dialogue with the Mapuche today, and have common reference points. My first lecture went all the way back to the 11th century. My second went back to the 15th century. This one can't go very far back, right? Because now we're dealing with the Tuareg. That's the currency, the name that we know exactly what that means or where it comes from, even though it has a long ancient history, right? And the emergence of any kind of state control in that region of Africa is very recent. Any kind, I mean, African, European, or otherwise. And we have developed this trope of understanding the problems in Africa. We blame it all on 1885, on the partition, and on our official borders, and on this notion that somehow we screwed Africa up. It was much better before, right? And then, of course, it's easy for us to go back to pre-colonial Africa and look for ways to imagine alternative scenarios the same way I did yesterday with the Mapuche. But this is much more complex than that. There really is no before, okay? What is going on in the Sahel, especially in Mali and Niger, the center of the sort of Azawad, the imagined Azawad nation, didn't begin until the beginning of the 20th century. The Tuareg were the last to actually lay down their arms against the encroachment of French settler colonialism in the borderlands. And very soon after that, we had independence, right? So in 1960, French Sudan is gradually carved up into several states, one of which will be Mali, the president of which, Modibo Keita, is a hero of contemporary Pan-Africanism for having essentially identified the roots of all inequality in that region in European colonialism, including the division between white and black Africans, which he blamed on modern-day colonialism, as if it didn't have, a longer history. Like all victims of Statolatry of that period, Modibo Keita envisioned the building of a socialist state through development understood as the ordering of society along sedentary lines, passing through self-sufficiency, agrarian reform, and eventually industrialization, right? So his first measures actually went in the direction of reinforcing state domination over nomadic lands, and immediately produced resistance and rebellion as a result. Because of the complexities of modern-day colonialism, imperialism, and discourses of race and things like that, Tuareg rebellions have been misunderstood over the years. And it's getting worse today because, as you all know, one of these maps shows it, it's been confused. Tuareg rebellion has been confused with jihadism. Right? It's very difficult to understand, to draw the lines and to understand what's going on there. So we have a vision of the Tuareg people as essentially untamed. And there's a problem for progress. So my idea to do this talk about the fugitivity of these populations stemmed from the creation of the Alliance of African States, right? The AES, Alliance des Africains. It's the AES, Alliance des États du Sahel, of the Sahelian states. Yeah. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso all had military coups beginning in 2020. And lo and behold, just like when I was young and the Sandinistas were taking power and the Shah was falling and everything like that, these nationalist military juntas, the first thing they did was they kicked out the French, and then they kicked out the United States of America, which had a big base in Niger to protect the uranium mines, which was supposedly, a front for, they said they were fighting jihadism, but they were basically building the infrastructure for a massive extraction of uranium from North Niger. My friend Issouf Agmaha was the mayor of the town that had an important uranium source. And my journey into Azawad began largely through him. I thought I'd circulate this so that you could sort of look through the pictures of his family and his lifestyle, as told in this book, which is a few years old in French. So, this alliance of Sahelian states has decided to stamp out nomadism altogether and to reinforce national borders even more than before. And these are not just any national borders about defining citizenship. These are police borders. There are places in the desert where they're building huge sand walls, believe it or not, to stop or to interrupt transhumance and the movement of people in the name of the struggle against trafficking and things like that. So, I go to Cuba, I go to Venezuela, and I hear people say, Viva la Revolución, this is anti-imperialism, this is good, this is a return of good old-fashioned Thomas Sankara style nationalist African revolution, Africa to the Africans. Here in the United States, there's a lot of excitement about this. There's a lot of internet buzz, because one of the young officers, Ibrahim Khaled, is sort of a cult figure now on Instagram. You can follow him. Everything is going very fast. These juntas have invited the Russian paramilitary force that used to be called Wagner in to do counterinsurgency to replace the French, who they kicked out. And of course, they've opened their investments to China and that's the Sahel. So there's all kinds of geopolitical things going on too. It's confusing. And the more I debated how to present this to you, the more I thought, well, instead of giving you the traditional linear kind of history of how this developed, right, with the names of all the organizations and things like that, I thought I would talk a little bit about who the people were and what their vision is of society, of what kind of social fabric and cosmovision was eroded and eventually probably mortally wounded by the development of capitalism in West Africa in the 20th century, even during the age of decolonization. So this is, for your information, the Sahel is. It reaches all the way over to Eritrea and to the Red Sea and out to Senegal and Saint-Louis. So it's basically the limit. Before the Europeans in the 15th century started sailing down the coast, the cartographers in Portugal believed that that was the end of Africa. They were trying to sail around this. Seriously, it's a fascinating study. Of course, they could never sail around that, but they knew about it because it was the last frontier that the Romans, the Arabs, everybody had written about, right? There was a certain lore, even going into, you go into biblical history, some of the Tuareg date their history back to biblical records. In any case, next picture. So this is a map that I like because it identifies the different Kels. Kel Air, Kel Ahagar. Kel means people of. And then there is a region of Tuareg influence that has to do with lineages and chiefdoms, Shefi. They go back a long time, right? So the influence of these centers of Tuareg culture has always radiated far beyond their actual presence in areas of the Sahel. The territory that the Tuareg believe is their area of political influence, right, where they have a rightful claim to sovereignty and freedom, is the area that is lined there. And it takes up big chunks, not just of Mali Niger, Burkina Faso, but look, Libya, Algeria, Morocco too, even parts of Mauritania. So the Tuareg, historically, who ran the trans-Saharan trade, and who have descendants going all the way down to the Phoenicians. It's very interesting that these so-called people of the desert, many of whom are light-skinned and blue-eyed, and of course Amazigh, or the so-called Berber ethnicity and tradition, have always seen themselves essential to the history of Africa. But the boundary that has been created in modern So this is a map of Mali. To navigate up the Niger River all the way to Gao, and then go to Timbuktu on camelback. This was before all this stuff happened that prevented us from doing that. But beyond Mopti and Sahel, which by the way were taken over by jihadists in 2012, most of the population is Songhai, the dominant ethnicity from the ancient Songhai Empire, Tuareg, and Arab. So most of these people have been desert people for centuries, and they've never really been integrated into the political, economic sphere of Bamako, which is far away from Bamako is. That's the capital of the state of Mali. There was no clinic when I was in Gao, and one of my students got sick, between Gao and Mopti. We had to use a random Cuban clinic, which existed in almost all the villages. And you laugh, we can talk about this, but also before the fall of Gaddafi, the Libyans had clinics everywhere too. So when the Libyan Jamahiriya fell, the entire social security system of Mali collapsed. Anyway, that's next. So this is, if you want to read the papers and understand the geopolitics of this, the zone that the rebels would like to see become independent so they can negotiate autonomy and get out from under the states of Niger and Mali in particular is all dotted. The top part is actually theirs. No one else is there. The Malian army isn't there. But half of what the territory that they claim is occupied by ACMI, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, which was the Islamist groups. Okay, so it's a huge problem. The central state sees all rebellion of any kind north of Mopti as being essentially jihadism and receives a lot of funding both from the United States and the European Union to fight jihadism, which then results in the massacres of populations, but also from the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to support the radical Wahhabist it's called, agenda of a sect of conservative Sunni Islam that had creeped into Mali decades before, that had nothing to do with this larger Tuareg conflict, but which opened up opportunities because funding was available for certain rebels and malcontents within the original coalition that established Azawad and declared its independence in 2012 for instead aligning with the Islamist cause. So that's a serious problem. Is there another one? Okay, I just wanted you to get an image of what the Alliance of Sahelian States is. It's a landlocked alliance between the military dictatorships of three countries, Burkina Faso, which used to be Upper Volta, Niger, and Mali. It is completely disconnected from the sea, right? So it has no outlet. Right now they're negotiating with Togo and Benin. They need to find a way to exist as a regional confederation or state. They've already adopted their own currency, which is a radical move, and they haven't yet been invaded for it, which I'm surprised by, right? They have established a total sovereignty. They've kicked out all foreign military bases. Russia is officially not there, just their paramilitaries. And this also, if you notice the boundaries of this, Algeria and Morocco are closely involved. There is a lot of gas and oil and uranium in this part of the world. And the rulers have resolved to basically generate enough capital to industrialize this alliance and develop it finally, right? With the help of foreign capital from the global south. And they have decreed that they are going to modernize and definitively consolidate the boundaries of the state. North of them, they have Algeria, a nominally revolutionary state with a very strong centralist bias. They have almost completely eliminated nomadism through forced settlement or sedentarization of the nomads over a period of about 25 years. And then you have Morocco, the arch enemy of Algeria, which is trying to negotiate with the AES to sort of get, whatever advantage they can from the realignment of sovereignty in this region. So there's a lot of geopolitics involved, and the old colonialists, the French, that I repeat, they don't know what to do. But remember, the AES, their entire revolutionary anti-imperialist agenda, is based on the same concepts of republicanism and on the same jurisprudence and law of republicanism that we discussed 2 days ago in France. In other words, not only are they stuck with colonial boundaries, they're stuck with the European idea of what the state does, right? And so they have entered into conflict, as you can imagine, with the Tuareg on a huge scale. In fact, since the Algiers Agreement of 2015, which temporarily pacified the north of Mali and Niger, incorporating some Tuareg into the national militaries and making some concessions and representation locally, but involving no development whatsoever. But since that period, the Tuareg had, because they're a people in the sense of sharing one language and a tradition and a story that I'm about to talk about, but they're also very dispersed. It's a tribal society, a nomadic society that is organized so as to not coalesce into a state at all. And I'll explain how in a minute. So there were so many different movements and factions, no one knew who did what. Most of them survived out of trafficking. And I also want to eliminate right off the bat one thing that most people get wrong about this, right? Everyone has heard that, when Sarkozy and Hillary Clinton conspired to overthrow Gaddafi, they created mass chaos in West Africa. You've all heard that, right? They did. They destroyed a state that was barely a state. It was 3 states. They eliminated the glue between them pretty much. That was the Jamahiriya, and Libya is still not unified. But at the time, and since 1980, Gaddafi had basically presented himself as the emperor of Africa, who was going to put all of his oil money into development and cooperation with West Africa. And he believed that the descendants of the Amazigh, the nomads, he's an Arab, remember, were his shock troops that he could use in his struggles for influence in places like Chad and the Central African Republic and also in Mali. So he invited many of the Tuareg, who were there anyway, because they were unemployed looking for jobs, and Libya is a very populated part of the Mediterranean. He invited them to train militarily. And when his regime collapsed, many of them returned to Mali and to Niger with weapons and training to be able to wage a guerrilla war that has since continued on a large scale. But everybody blames Gaddafi as if somehow the Tuareg had this link to the Jamahiriya and this, they were linked to terrorism. No, actually, Muammar Gaddafi despised Berber cultures. He claimed they didn't exist, that they were a Western invention to divide the Arab empire. And he had absolutely no respect for the ethics or the culture of the Tuareg. He simply saw them as soldiers. So all of the identifications of the Tuareg, first of all, they had slaves, bad, right? Second of all, they're nomads, bad, right? Third of all, they're linked to Gaddafi, bad. Fourth, they're Muslims, and they have jihadists, bad, right? There's a real stigma surrounding these people that I think needs to be lifted. All right, that's it, right?
I think so, yeah.
Any comments or questions so far? before I start talking about who the Tamashek are, because that's their actual name. So, first of all, these are semi-nomadic people who, for centuries, have combined transhumance, or camel travel, across the deserts in West Africa, North Africa, and East Africa, with small-scale organic farming in oases. Second of all, they have never really had a territory per se. They have a concept of territory, but there is not a single law or record of a Tuareg ever owning any land, or of a Tuareg polity or confederation ever having any rights to land. So this is a major difference. Can you show me?
Yeah, I got you.
Because now I've got this thing in my face, and I can barely see my.
Yeah, we'll switch off the projector too.
Thank you. Oh, good. Thank you. So unlike the Mapuche, they have no historic claim to land. They can't make any legal claim to any land. And of course, the French, who invaded as soon as Azawad was declared independent in 2012, and the Malian state, where Azawad is located, have used this against them. This is a fantasy. You don't even have a historical record to prove that you're a people, you know? Who are you? The Tamashek language is what unifies them. There's a high prestige of women. It's a matriarchal society. So that's a very interesting aspect that I think we'll talk more about. So they are Amazigh, or Berber, which is a linguistic family, even though it's become racialized in the course of interaction with the Arab Ottoman world and the Latin Christian European world. Berbers are not actually a people, right? They are tribes, of which, for example, the Kabyle in Algeria are one, right? There are different ones in Morocco. You see them all over North and West Africa. But what they have in common is the language, which is very ancient, which was written in the sand, which has characters that were never translated into European characters, but that still are understood by people as their main lingua franca. They live in peripheral desert regions of modern post-colonial states, thousands of miles, as I said before, from any centers, like Niamey or Bamako, which are the capitals, or Tripoli, or there are plenty of Tuareg in all of these cities, but the main society lives thousands and thousands of miles away. Nationally, there are a small fraction of the population in each of the states, but like the Mapuche, they reject the notion of minority, because they're not part of a nation that they don't recognize. They don't want to be counted and set aside on the margins of the nation state. They want to be sovereign over the part that is claimed by the nation state that they have always claimed as their land. The nomadic way of life faces huge challenges over the past half century. In the 60s, nomads had come out of colonialism fairly prosperous. They were clever. They used their position as the only possible guides for the French as they tried to rationalize and organize the Sahelian region. There were conflicts among different tribes, and some of them helped the French briefly before turning against them, and others fought them. But there's this image of colonial France advancing with the camels and the warriors of the blue people of the desert showing them the way, of the Tuareg as kind of the guides of the penetrating empire. And when you look at those pictures, they're in black and white, but not all of the faces are white. I also want to stress one thing. We're going to talk a little bit about race and why it confuses our understanding of the Tuareg, right? But the whole time that I was in this region, and I went 4 or 5 times, none of the tribal areas that I frequented were not multiracial, as I understood it, right? There were plenty of black faces within the Tuareg tribes. And it took me a while to understand, even though I knew that there was a history of bondage there, right? And servitude. It took me a while to understand that their understanding of race is not the same as ours. But suffice to say that French colonialism depicted the Tuareg as heroes because they were great warriors. So, for example, I was raised with pictures in my school textbooks glorifying colonialism in France, seeing pictures of Tuaregs playing games war games on camels. You know, these men in these big robes, and it was very romantic. These long swords, or I think I had one in my room to play with. The Tuareg are romanticized by the French for that reason. They also have a strong sense of their own aristocracy. And they are divided into castes, as we would call them today, right? Traditional Tuareg tribes have Imajahim, which means nobility, Imahad, which means vassals, so people of a lesser status, Inadid, which means forgers. All of the societies, not just the nomads in West Africa, have these traditions. And then there's the Ingowellen, or the free people, who were once somebody's captive or slave or servant, but who are now free and equal, and the Inclan, who are the lower class and who are generally in service situations. All belong, though, to one thing, one type of society, the federation of all federations, which is called Temust. And this is why so many Tino-men songs are called Temust, right? This is the Tuareg nation. They have the same references, cultural references, the same stories, and the same code of honor across castes also, okay? They all have their place in the community. I'll talk about that for a little bit. Most of that reference or code of honor for a stratified and segmented tribal society with many internal inequalities has been destroyed over the process of colonialism and resistance to it. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is not a static traditional society. It's a society that's already undergone a lot of transformation. But the Temust, anyway, is the social body that unites all individuals, and it's associated with Aka, which means the same thing as pays in French, or país in Spanish. It's basically the land. So this is a grounded people in a land, despite how we think of nomadism. There's also all kinds of metaphors that are actually built into the architecture of the tents to explain how the community works. So the Tafala Nimagen, or the roof of the Tuareg, is actually an explanation for all of Tuareg society in the places where the tents are planted and where authority is grounded. Then there's the Temurt, which encompasses the Temust, or the Tuareg nation, and establishes lineages and relations with Arabs, Ethiopians, Fulani, Egyptians, and even Jews. These are viewed as alliances de parenté, alliances of lineage. What's this, parenté? Right? Lineage, parentesco. Systems, yeah, but they see themselves as related to these people, you know, if not physically and biologically, at least historically and spiritually. So there's basically a way of delineating a civilization that harkens back to ancient civilizations of the area, right? But is also very open and very fluid. Local leaders are called Amenukal, so these are famous characters in West African novels, but they're mediators, not political authorities. There's no such thing, really, as a political king, or hierarch, or pope, or priest, or even imam in this culture that has more authority than the collective itself. The Tuareg represent themselves as a social body, which before colonial rule was made up of 4 large political poles. The Ajer in the northeast, the Ahagar in the northwest, the Ayir in the southeast, which is where I'm familiar with, and the Tadik Mekat in the southwest. And then there was another intermediary zone formation where Tuareg tribes in the middle. So from Azawad comes the name Azawad as a territory in the middle of all this chaos of modernity, colonialism, and separation. They're trying to create a kind of middle ground, you know, kind of Nahantla, for those of you who know the history of Mexico, an intermediary place that they can control. They have an organic vision of society perceived as a structure that articulates different but complementary elements. So everything is in the tent. People live in tents. What's interesting is, even when they move to the shanty towns of Lagos, or Tripoli, they build tents. Not just because they need protection from the rain, but because the structure of the tent represents the continuity of the social order. There's a protective function of the tent which provides shelter, but also allows the body to move and to be autonomous. Each object, each element of this space is in motion on a universal cyclical journey, just like that of the universe itself. So the idea is that even if the tent stays there for 3 months, we're on our way to somewhere else, right? The energy of the world is taking us somewhere else. This is sort of, when you talk to Tuareg people, they cannot stand the idea of staying in the same place. On every level, including marriage. You can tell stories about what happened when European tourists came along and fell in love with the Tuareg. But that's another thing. So one of the best scholars of this, Dr. Azawad, writes this: "Thus everything advances and transforms. The body extends its limbs and the tent its roof, increasing the limits of their range. More than the parts making up the whole, constantly changing, this vision emphasizes the links which unify them." The importance of mediators. Every Tuareg designates a mediator with the outside world, and those tend to be, believe it or not, freedmen, Africans with black skin, former members of the Songhai culture, or of the Hausa culture, who ended up marrying into the tribal confederations of the Tuareg, and who lost their dependence or their servitude status, and cannot achieve the same political authority as the heads of the noble lineages, but can be ambassadors, linking the Tuareg to the rest of Africa. And the meeting places and junctions are placed at intersections of territories. So, roads. Has anybody been over there? Okay, so you remember what a road looks like in the Sahel?
Yeah.
What does it look like?
A track.
It looks like tracks of tires, because for the last 50 years they've had Jeeps, but before that it was tracks of camels, and that's it. That's a road. But the Tuareg know those roads. They are mapped out conceptually, and they're inscribed physically in the landscape. They're not these, they're not just moving around haphazardly, so this is important. Wells. One of the things you discover if you spend enough time there is that the well is the meeting place of all societies. It's the place where you learn several languages. Everybody in the Sahel speaks 3 or 4 or 5 languages that they use at the well. They teach their kids those languages because it's a means of accessing the outside world, which is very important to the Tuareg. The wells, by the way, are in places where there would be natural wells anyway, but the nomads over hundreds of years have cultivated, the engineering of the space between the wells and things like that. Along come Western modernizers and NGOs with nice ideas about getting the water out of the desert. They drill holes without knowing where and create a major disaster, which is called drought, desertification, and they take away a lot of the sustenance, not just of the pasture and of the animals, but also of the Tuareg themselves. So you have to really, when you're discussing things like this with the Tuareg, they are experts of their environment, of their ecology. They have a plan. And I'm not an anthropologist. I know many of you are. But it would take many years of coexisting and interacting with these folks and comparing, concepts to understand how durable these ideas are, even in the face of all of the colonial and post-colonial disasters that have fallen upon them. So this structure is applied at every social and territorial formation, no matter how large. So from the tent and the camp, all society at large, this is how they view it. The assumed sameness of nature, home, and the body allow metaphorical register to another. So political and social entities are designated by names borrowed from the human anatomy, like wrist, thigh, hips, and chest. This is true in other cultures too, but the metaphor of the body is very powerful here. Names of numerous confederations of tribes refer to the vocabulary of the tent and its interior spaces. The idea of this philosophy is that because the surrounding world is embodied, one can use these tools to build the self in one's relation or relationships with the outside, right? If you know what organ of the body you are, you can live. So there's the human body, all of this is one, Tuareg society and human civilization, according to the Tuareg, is one body in perpetual motion made up of three subsections of the body. The human body, the social body, and the territorial body. Any stiffening or dysfunction of any of these three parts makes the body vulnerable to disease, to decay, and to conflict. Right, so think about that. The human body has to be healthy, the social body has to be healthy, and the territorial body, which is the ecology, has to be healthy. All of them are linked. All of them are very carefully balanced so as to not to, upend one another. But any fragility on any of those levels is going to make the whole ecosystem collapse. This was explained to me by Yusuf, whose face you saw. By the way, I invited him to do a speaking tour in the United States, and people were scared because Tuareg men wear face covers. Yeah. So this was during the War on Terror. And they're like, dude, you're hanging out with the terrorists. Well, this guy is actually an economist with a PhD. He's the mayor of a major city, and like all Tuareg, he made sure that 2 of his 12 children live in what he calls la bouse, the bush, in the camp. They never eliminated, no matter how disrupted their lifestyles, right? The tie to the original tent. All relationships with territory, nature, and space are imbued with the logic of the system of corporeality. So nomadism is not just the itinerant way of life associated with pastoralism, which is what we all assume when we study human history. It's also a philosophy, a manner of interpreting reality and acting upon it. So relationships between the parts must be constantly negotiated and rebalanced to ensure the harmonious interconnection of the whole. All Tuareg educate their children to stress the skills that you acquire through mobility and connection with the outside world. Communication, adaptability to new situations. That is fascinating. When I first started studying Africa, under Bob Barnes at Yale, was kind of a minor. He was an expert on Guinea, and he would always talk about African cultures as if they all existed separately from one another. I'm sure he knows better, and he wrote a textbook, right? But he would present it to us as, hey, this is interesting. They're so traditional. As if there's a timelessness to African identities that we can name and that we can classify, right? When we think of the Tuareg, obviously, these are very difficult concepts to understand, and their cultural references are very different from ours, especially when we start talking about revolution, autonomy, and things like that. But in reality, they are much more open to change than we are. Their resistance to categories that might stiffen, as they say, any part of that body that is the ecosystem of human life is incredible. So all Tuareg educate their children, again, to be clever, open to the world, also adaptable, willing to temporarily change anything from their behavior to their dress to whatever in order to, not enter into conflict or not to get themselves in trouble, for example, in major cities of the coast or in their interactions with other people. There have always been tensions between the people of Mali for various reasons having to do with land and policy and taxes. Everybody knows this, right? And increasingly in colonial times because of color. So they will downplay those differences and develop relationships. Again, the importance of the negotiator, right? Of the intermediary, of the messenger. This means that culture is seen as plural, even theirs. So if you ask a Tuareg scientist, because there are anthropologists who look it up, okay, what is your culture? They will say, culture doesn't exist. It's not this thing that you can somehow classify and send to the Encyclopedia Britannica with a definition. I'm like, these are postmodernists before us, right? They're basically saying, there's nothing to deconstruct here. It's a motion, a body in motion. Syncretism, very important. So their Islam is unrecognizable with even Sufi Islam from Senegal that I was familiar with, right? One of the reasons the French like the Tuareg better than everybody else in the region is they're monogamous. Whereas Muslims in the region, in Senegal, in Mali, as you may know, in Chad, are polygamous. In Mali, you can have up to 4 wives. Right? So when I was traveling with the Tuareg guide into Dogo country in the middle of Mali, fascinating civilization in its own right. Dogo, I'm sure you've all heard of it, right? These people were seething with contempt. That's one another over the issue of how many wives you could have. You know, the polygamists were like, these are what, Christians? And they were absolutely, you know, the idea again of the corporeality of relationships, right? Monogamy is just a way of balancing the feminine and the masculine and keeping the lineage, you know, steady. Of course, with the woman having much more power than in the patriarchal system. So children have links to several languages. They also have many parental links. Like they raise their children to have biological parents, but also parents in other lineages. Kind of like the godfather, godmother, you know, padrino, padrina kind of concept in Latin America. Why? Because you don't want to become isolated. You don't want something happen to your parents and suddenly you're thrown out there. You're a member of a tribe, but you're not a member of a tribe at the club. It's not the YMCA. You have to have actual parentesco. I can't figure out the word in English still.
Kinship?
Huh? It's lineage, I guess. Parenthood, whatever.
Well, anthropologists say kinship.
Kinship!
That's a classic.
Thank you.
Anthropology.
I couldn't find the word.
Sorry.
Learning is viewed as a pursuit of knowledge. So, outside of the tradition, if all you know is your traditions, you're useless. And that's interesting, right? I mean, kids are very interesting. They're always asking questions because they're told, whatever you do, you know, don't stick to your guns. There's this tikruru. A tikruru is a person of mixed culture, highly valued, masters the standards of several worlds while submitting to the logic of none. So someone who is a member of several lineages within a confederation may also be linked to another confederation and may also have some kind of kinship, thank you for the word, outside of the Tamashek universe. That person is of mixed culture, not mixed race, right? And people who are almost all Tigruru are dark-skinned Africans from the sub-Saharan regions. Those who are in the tribes are seen not just as mediators, but as highly valued interpreters of whatever out there can contribute to the survival and the betterment of the community, of the Timus. They see the earth as something that has to be respected and protected. One way to not damage the land is to not stick around for too long in one place. So this is an old wisdom. Which, I mean, they're losing the ability to move, so I'm going to get there, right? I mean, the space is becoming incredibly smaller as the years go on. You know, those of us who sit around fantasizing about the end of the Westphalian state, the end of Statolatry, no, it's not only coming back, it's coming back like it's like cell in a prison. The walls are closing in on you. It's important to understand this, right? We can talk about mobility, we can talk about fluidity, we can talk about globalization. There is a lot of mobility of the Tuareg people, but on notions of identity that are related to the land, such as this, the walls are closing in on these people. There's no way out. I'll talk about how they envision borders in a minute. So, the only kind-friendly desert land is that which has been crossed, known, you know, and actually tamed. Land that has been shaped by nomadic paths, so the earth upon which humans have set up their markers, right? There is no such thing in the Tuareg mind as a land that isn't lived on by human beings. Land is marked by human beings. But there's no such thing as a human being without land. So if you think about, the best I could do to translate that in my head, all right? If you think about that, someone who has that belief and is talking to a colonial officer who explains to them that they've never owned any property, that they don't have any land or any identity, I mean, there's a total dialogue of dialogue de sordos. This is something that they can't understand each other. So this leads the Tuareg to manage and organize the economic use of the soil in ways that optimize the exploitation and obviously regeneration of resources. My friend, the agronomist, got a dissertation, got a PhD in France, but when he came back, that was his contribution to the field of agronomy. He basically argued with all of the French agronomists about the best uses of the soil and how to bring things that weren't usually cultivated in West Africa to people, such as important medicinal plants and things like that. So you have the territory because you're responsible for the land. You don't just live somewhere. It's your territory because you are its curator. Each social unit, from the smallest, the camp, to the largest, society as a whole, is associated with the territory, which is itself organized in other vaster territories. So it's interesting for those of you who know anarchist history, how anarchists traditionally envision the organization of society from the bottom up. You know, a local resistance society, then you have sort of an intermediate local association, and then you have a federation, and then it goes up to a scale of horizontal cooperation and consultation, never a state. But this is something that's almost intrinsic to Tuareg life. There's no such thing as a political leader over any aspects of the Tamus. You can't have despotism unless you break tradition, right? Every unit exercises the rights of use, which are preferential but not exclusive over the land, and they change with movements or climatic conditions. So everybody has use of rights. There's no such thing as property. So grazing lands, wells, game, there's small game to hunt in the desert, food, the wood that people pick up. These are all resources that cannot be appropriated by a single person. So if a tourist decides to run around making fires by picking up the wood, they're going to get talked to. You know, that wood is there for a reason. Even if it's dead wood, you know, even if it's a symbol of desertification and we have no grazing lands or whatever, we have plans for that wood. So there are arbiters and negotiators at different levels of community who facilitate the smooth sort of relations of usufruct of all of this natural world. Does that make sense? No matter how small, each space is seen as playing a part in the larger picture as one element of the whole. So you've got the wilderness and the domestic space. These are mutually indispensable and complementary things. Contact and dialogue between them is established over the course of nomadic pathing. So without weaving relationships between the same and the different, no stable existence could appear possible. One of the reasons I'm talking about all this philosophy now is if you think about it, the Tuareg are perfectly epistemologically, ontologically, whatever, armed to present a solution, you know, to the nations of West Africa for their plight. Think about how many ideas we could get out of this if we were legislators. Nomadism is not vagrancy. That's very important because today, nomadism is classified in law in Mali as vagrancy, which is the same process that happened, by the way, during the persecution of the fugitives of Statolatry in Europe, and still happens with the Roma people, etc. It's organized. So nomadism, people move for reasons that are, they may be necessity, whatever, but it's organized. And this is the difference with the most recent trend, which is, of course, people having to leave their economic somewhere. Chaotic break with this. People are moving for no apparent reason, to places for no apparent reason, and developing ideas and going through acculturation for no apparent reason. And this catastrophe, which is the catastrophe when the modern world befalls, on any traditional society, is tended to and healed through the return to the original community that is envisaged in the entire philosophy that I just described. It's impossible to break with your Tuareg heritage, no matter where you live. There's some in San Francisco, some in Berber. So, each displacement builds and reshapes the political and territorial body. That's the idea. The nomadic frontier is a place of interfaces in the of connections, of crossroads, rise zones, if you read the news, right? This is very exciting for people. Right? I mean, I went there with a lot of theory in my head. It's not a watertight barrier, though. You can't have, foreigners. There's no such thing as the concept of foreigner in Tuareg language. They don't have a word for it. Isn't that interesting? Étranger, stranger, foreigner. These are terms that we developed historically, but that are not natural concepts. There are rites of passage, perhaps, that might be called frontiers, and they happen in markets, wells, roads, markers of the frontier, but they're not territorial. They're social, cultural, and linguistic frontiers. They're areas of familiarity that people have, the architecture of which people living there have contributed to, and not just the Tuareg. They're very aware that they are a minority, even in what is now Azawad. In the province of Timbuktu, the Sangoi are numerically more important, and so are Arabs. So state boundaries, on the other hand, that we're familiar with, they're fixed, they can't be moved, they are purposely made to not be transgressed, to not be crossed. They separate what's assumed to be separate entities. Crossing boundaries implies some kind of transgression, which can range from criminality, depending on how happy you are about it, right? In the Sahel, modern boundaries were mapped according to the sent to conquer the desert at the end of the 19th century. So French troops came from Algiers and from Dakar. Turkish troops came from the Ottoman areas, and later Italians, we're talking about Libya. They were closing in on this area as well, and the British were closing in from the south, Nigeria and Hausa territory. All of these modern empires were drawing lines that didn't exist in real life. Nomadic zones that we're talking about, after they were pacified, which means that the warriors had laid down their arms temporarily, there were at least 6 or 7 rebellions since that I could have lectured on here if I wanted to celebrate revolution. But I thought I'd take another angle this time. These frontiers the French created in northern Mali, they attracted adventurers, prostitutes, delinquents, customs officials, all the same thing. Seriously? Many of them were actually convicts who were sent there as punishment from French prisons, Corsicans especially. So you were sent to the colony to be a customs officer in a desert outpost because your republic wanted to get rid of you. And there you asserted your authority, usually in a simplistic and barbaric way, right? According to codes of law of indigènes in France, which separated people according to racial and linguistic categories. And the French Sudan that came out of this, the Sahelian zones were the last to submit to it, didn't last very long. It only lasted a few decades, just the time for a few world wars that Africans died, in for the cause of the Republic in the tens of thousands. Meanwhile, what is left of the colonialism, the biggest trace of that ephemeral period of occupation was the creation of militias made up of people of sedentary populations to basically track down the nomads and, plant them somewhere. So sedentarization was the goal of colonialism, as was doing anything in their power to avoid the unification of the different peoples and segments of the Tuareg people themselves against colonial authority. So, for example, conflicts between Tuareg and Arab confederations never existed before French colonialism. Not that we know of anyway in written history. You have to go way back and read chronicles that were written in the time of, even Batuta. But there's no history here of ethnic warfare. There's no history of ethnicity being used as a concept to explain the grid of different cultures. The Tuareg do not regard themselves as an ethnicity. At least in my experience, it drives them crazy when we have that conversation. All right? Unless you limit your definition of ethnicity to the bare bones of language. So When independence happens in 1960, Modibo Keita, again, blamed colonialism for creating all the divisions that were there, for even inventing the notion of race. In that sense, he had a point, right? By the time Mali became independent and broke away from what was supposed to be a big unified confederation going from Senegal to Niger and Chad, right? At first, the Africans wanted to be unified, then different colonial powers that be split them up into little states, most of which were landlocked and doomed to poverty, such as Mali. But in the meantime, the role of traditional authorities had been severely weakened. In all societies or sub-societies within Mali, including the Tuareg. But by that time, the ability of the French to make alliances with the nobles in certain tribes, like the Kelal Ifogas, who are famous, for their noble tradition, their pretense to having leaders of vast empires and things like that, they were discredited, and many of the people that survived the repression and the sedentarization were not from the noble castes, but from the intermediary and freedman castes. So there was this kind of forced integration into a national fabric failed, but the weakening of traditional forms of authority that may be obstacles, for example, to egalitarian politics, had also occurred. Does that make sense? So that's a hypothesis. If anybody wanted to do research with me or help me out here, I'd like to say that the Tuareg are the perfect candidates for conversations about freedom and equality on all different levels, right? But it's very difficult to find a language for that when you're discussing societies until recently have been so segmented and so hierarchical, right? Just because they're matrilineal, that doesn't make them feminist, right? And we can go on and on. We gotta be careful. Just like the Republicans who created the empire in the first place in France, how we transpose, our categories to people who have different ways of describing similar things that have something to teach us. So, if I wanted to describe the overall effect of colonialism on the Tuareg simply, I would say, well, they were whitened, first of all. In other words, this idea that Berbers were light-skinned and that their servants were dark-skinned, therefore there was a racial divide, and if Black Africa was going to be independent, it had to get rid of the light-skinned Berbers. This idea was weakened during the Algerian Revolution, during which Frantz Fanon, by the way, was actually tasked by the National Liberation Front to go to Mali and organize arms trafficking, which, if you've read any Fanon, you know that Fanon actually worked with the Tuareg, who he was absolutely shocked, knew the desert better than anyone else, and were perfectly capable of modern trafficking. Right? There's the passages in Fanon that are fascinating about this. Of course, the Algerian state won't remember that, but it is a moment that I think needs to be researched more. They were also feudalized. The myth started, both in Africa among Bambara, Mande, Malinka communities, other communities of the majority of Mali in the south. The idea was that these were feudal remnants. If you're a Marxist, that makes perfect sense, right? The Europeans had their feudal serfs, Africans had their feudal nomads. These will disappear with modernization. These will be rubbed out. Have I lost you? If you lose Andre, you're done. They were also made very archaic. The way anthropologists started writing about the Tuareg was kind of an inventory of the things they do that seemed to be out of date, including the way they domesticated their, they treated their domestic animals and processed their food and everything like that. So they became kind of a curiosity. During the great colonial universal expositions, the only positive things about the Tuareg were their warrior skills. Everything else was hopelessly linked to some kind of pre-literate stage of human civilization. They were also defined as ethnic, which I've already said is a notion that is controversial now. They were called the Lords of the Sands, the Pirates of the Desert, foreign to Africa. having no organized community, no property, no legitimate really claim to anything. They're just there. They're left over from times when the territory wasn't domesticated, when the nation hadn't really asserted its sovereignty over the land. If you take those Republican principles that we talked about before, the secularization, the control of people and resources within a space that could be turned into a space of representation, right? The Marxists, the revolutionaries, and currently the military that are in power in these states view these desert zones and the people who live in them as disposable. They do not fit into the plan. Are you convinced that Statolatry has fugitives? I think it produces them everywhere, to an ever greater degree. We still have not defined or explained why every time genuine advocates or fighters for all kinds of freedoms achieve state power, it's all downhill from there. Unless they have theorized what has to be done to transform the kind of Republican state that I talked about 2 days ago. So, I've already talked a little bit about race, right? So now it's a problem that the Bella, as they're called, and the Imgad, who are the freed blacks, even though they're practically equal in the fabric of Tuareg society for all ends and purposes, and even considered valuable in relations with the outside, there's this notion among many Pan-Africanists and people who have adopted a racial topography of the Atlantic world, including Africa, that celebrates blackness as the overarching category of African identity, right? This is the problem. If you go to the Sahel looking for black people, and I had students who did this when we went, right? You're shocked that they're there, right? They don't consider themselves black, they have other identities. And most importantly, racial categories are usually identified with the enemy. Anybody who comes into Tuareg society and asks a question about the Bella, oh, you got slaves, right? Is remembered as a representative of the French military, French colonialism, or some kind of campaign from Bamako to discredit Tuareg society. It's very difficult to talk about stratification and subordination along lines of caste because it's so mixed up with race that basically it's like, look how you treat black people. So that's a difficult question. I have no answer for it. I'm just throwing it out there. It's very difficult to get sympathy in the place that I work for working the Tuareg. I have a Nigerian colleague who teaches the Africans in the department, and he looks at me as just some crazy French tourist who romanticizes the pirates of the desert with the blue eyes and the, which, that kind of Frenchman exists. It's a tourist trap. But I'll be damned if it's me. I hope. The question of race, and the whole question of coloniality of power is very, very difficult to break down. One last thing I want to talk about is Ishumab. Do I still have a few minutes? Just make sure. So basically, from the 1970s onward, with war, civil conflict, persecution, desertification, lack of development, you name it, all these reasons, young people had to leave the confederations and go to all these different cities along the West African and North African coast. Many of them went to Libya where they were welcomed and given jobs, as I said before. But some of them went to Lagos, some of them went to Dakar, some of them went to Lomé, right? Where they discovered another Africa. They were basically braceros. They were, manual workers. Some of them were artisans who tried to sell jewelry, tried to, complement whatever income their family had from the, they would send home 80%, I think, of their earnings, so typical immigrants, right? Just creating extended networks of mutual aid and support. But they were all over the place. I mean, they were despised usually by the women back home because they were breaking the lineage. They were getting away from the family and the clan. They were somehow, deviating from the norm. They weren't headed to a place where the group, the Temus, had given them a mission. They were just desperately looking for work, right? So this whole capitalist chaos that we're used to was traumatic to Tuareg society. But they developed an ideology called Ishuma. which is a derivative of the French word chômeur, which means unemployed. Some of you may recognize it as a genre of world music. If you've seen the movie Desert Rebels, or other versions of documentaries in the Tuareg, they built a hybrid culture of playing traditional desert music, which is absolutely amazing, in my view, right? With modern day instruments from rock bands and things like that, and using modern day technologies of recording. They started holding world music festivals out in the desert. They have great musicians here in the United States who go to and play it. I've been to one of those. It's absolutely magical. You go for 800 miles, there's nothing, all of a sudden there's a concert in the desert with perfect technology and people playing traditional music. So Ishimar music is a genre. Again, they're the last real nomads, really, the last, pioneers of nomadism writ large in a tragic history of sedentarization that has reduced and enclosed the Tuareg population in 5 different countries, in arid lands, like on reservations. There's again this danger. One thing, they lose all respect for hierarchy and segmentation because they cease to be members of a tribe that's inscribed in the body of the land. But they're also in danger of losing their identity and understand that, right? So, Teshumara is the word in Tamashek that is used to designate the return to the source, the claiming of the history and the culture of that body of Temus, where you were raised, right? It's very similar to Mapuche intellectuals from Santiago and Concepcion going back to their communities, looking for answers to contemporary political and social questions in sabiduría, or traditional knowledge, and claiming the identity of Mapuche, and then transfiguring it in so many ways, because you can't just reinvent an indigenous culture that has been maligned and destroyed and moved around and contained for several hundred years. So they have terms for this. I am an Ishimar. I am part of the Teshumara, of the return. And this means going back physically, not necessarily permanently, but maintaining the ties, as I described them before, as they theorized in Tuareg philosophy, right, that would otherwise be lost. In the meantime, they're facing, the challenges of migration and enemies. So in the early 1990s, in Mali, there was a movement among the Songhoy population that had some participation among Tuareg Bella, and this is all very complicated, right? They were organized militias that were paid by the state to go kill people of light skin on the frontier. They were called the Gandokoi. And of course, just like in the South Sudan or anyway, when you radicalize people to go kill, or think about Rwanda, right? You're always doing it based on the promise of some kind of redemption for those people who are facing incredible suffering, right? So you will finally get your land back. Look at this vast frontier from these white nomads that have never done anything from you. Just go kill some Tuareg. The Gandokoi were all between 16 and 24 years old, and they were given money to run through villages to kill them, burn tents. And in Niger, there was the Committee for the Defense of Tazara, or the CAT, which was funded by the United Arab Emirates, and it was an Arab movement that was in charge of reclaiming the Sahel for the Arab people, because it had been stolen through European colonialism by their Berber allies. All of this drives you crazy if you're a historian, and so does the evening news here, right? Anyway, they received support, including from USAID, in the case of the Gandokoi. There was even support in US public opinion for those of you who follow West African affairs, because these were black people fighting against non-black people, so these were the true Africans. I wish I could stay another couple of days to work through this with you guys, because I hate talking about it. It's uncomfortable, because the entire transposition of our racial politics to theirs just feels potentially genocidal, It's not the same as it is here. And I'm going to write about it, so I'm worried. So I do need feedback, okay? So, nomads, whites, reactionaries, feudal lords. On the other side, settlers, blacks, nationalists, progressives, Pan-Africanists. That's the line of division that was drawn. And of course, the idea is to contain nomadism and not only settle labor, but just like in any process of proletarianization, guess what the biggest employer is in northern Niger and Mali? Mines. Okay? We need to take these people away from their camels and bring them into the mines. It's a classic proletarianization process, right? So for the Tuareg today, the problem is to find more crossover points within, which to be allowed to continue the movement that is theorized in their whole version of nomadism. So they say the Sahel has been transformed into a pen, a cell, a cage. This is how they talk about the Republic. A place of exclusion, suffocation under a slab of stone. Does this sound positive to anybody? Because this is what the UN is calling modernization projects and the integration and assimilation of peripheral zones into a national economy. This sidelining is blamed not only on the dispossession of political, social, and territorial rights, and on the erection of national state boundaries. That's sort of the undergraduate analysis that we've all arrived at. But it's also blamed on a massive fragmentation of the community and of the destruction of the social fabric. That balance that I was talking about before, all of the parts of the body are dying because there's no balance between family, lineage, habitat, land, space, outside. The fixedness, the immutability of state domination, which is at the center of Tuareg philosophy, is winning in the landscape. There are fewer and fewer places to go. So the intelligentsia that is feeding me all of these interpretations and helping me understand the evolution of the situation, helping me understand, for example, that the new identitarian assignations are artificial and not necessarily embraced by the people who we say embrace them. That the divide and rule process is still underway. In the great Republican tradition, people are being asked to just abandon their ethnic identities and be Malians or be Nigerians, right? But in reality, they're defining what a true Malian or Nigerian should be. And in so doing, they're practicing ethnocide. The same thing happened in France over hundreds of years. And there's another problem too, which is the way the MNLA, which is now dissolved, although it's been resurrected into an even larger alliance just a year ago, because of the military states going after the nomads. The resistance is back. The Algeria Accords are broken. There's a new guerrilla war beginning, and it is this time completely cut off from the Al-Qaeda branch of traffickers and chaos makers in that region, right? They want to make it clear that they're not part of that Salafism at all, even though before they had made tactical arrangements that caused them to essentially experience the full hell of French military intervention during the Serval operation, which is now over. So the war in Mali has returned. Less so in northern Niger. That's a separate issue, but the conflict is not resolved. The point I wanted to make, though, is that one of the weaknesses of the independence movement that wants Azawad to be autonomous or independent so they can negotiate a way out of the state is that it can sort of conceived of Mali as a pluriethnic society, right? So, in doing so, they categorize themselves as just another ethnic group. And in doing so, they gave their enemies an argument, well, you can't be leading that pluriethnic state because the Arabs and the Songhai have more people than you. You see what I'm saying? And that was one of the reasons that many Tuareg opposed independence in 2012. But if you don't remember that particular chain of events in the middle of the war on terror, the Tuareg swept down on Mali and were at the doors of Bamako. They almost took over the whole country before retreating and then fighting off the counterinsurrection, which was funded by the French, in alliance with Salafist movements that turned around and started massacring them and caused a civil war between Islamists and independence fighters and led to the very unfortunate lumping of all these people together as troublemakers by the alliance of Sahelian states. I would just end by saying that we're entering a new cycle in which the Tuareg people have not come together any more than they were 100 years ago as an independent polity of any kind. It's pointless to do a kind of separatism tourism thing and go look for institutions of liberation, right? On the contrary, the most valuable and effective epistemologies of freedom that existed a century ago have been severely eroded, as have, though, also the traditional and archaic aspects of Tuareg segmentation and stratification, the caste system. But the Tuareg are seeking for unity in the ability to avoid walls and avoid customs and avoid citizenship laws and live under the radar of all of that while still having relationships with the states and the peoples that surround them. That's the interesting part of their philosophy. They're not trying to create an ethno-nationalist kind of entity. They're not trying to turn Azawad into a place where they can live in a zoo. What they want is a place where there is no state and no time and no funding to create one. Instead, solutions that can enter into a conversation with the rest of the ecology of the region as to how to best use the resources, curate the land, and keep the people balanced and whole in their bodies.